Now then, team. I had a chat with Beth Eggleston, who brings huge amounts of humanitarian coordination expertise, has worked in places like Afghanistan, Liberia, and has worked with the sort of big INGO players that you'll have heard of, and also for the UN as well. She's also a co-founder of Humanitarian Advisory Group out of Australia, which is all about challenging the status quo of humanitarian aid. So in this episode, we talk about what similarities there are between domestic charities here in the UK and INGOs working in international contexts. We talk about bureaucracy, the bureaucracy within the UN. We talk about civil-military coordination. We talk about why the word localization is problematic, but why locally led humanitarian responses are critical. So, grab a brew, enjoy the conversation. See you in a bit. Beth, thank you so much for coming on to Causes.
Hello, Dave. It's lovely to see you.
You're our first international guest. So where are you? Where are you coming in from?
So I'm joining you tonight, my time, from the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people, which is an hour north of Naarm or Melbourne in Victoria, Australia.
Amazing. All right, so let's dive in. So give me a 1-minute intro to Beth Eggleston. You can take that as holistically, as broadly as you'd like.
Wow. So, yes. So from Australia, and yeah, a sugar fiend. I have to frame everything with that. But yeah, a real sugar fiend. I have worked in the international humanitarian sector for quite some time. As someone said the other day, you can just say that you're seasoned, not necessarily that you're older. But yeah, probably about 25 years now. And I've been fortunate enough to work with some local NGOs, international NGOs, the UN system, and now working with Humanitarian Advisory Group.
Amazing. You've touched on it there. Can you give me a sort of another sort of 1-minute whistle-stop tour of the career moments you've had?
Yes, and I was reflecting on this recently because I was speaking at an event about volunteering. So I was fortunate enough, and when I say fortunate, I guess that is a luxury of my privilege, to be able to kick off my career with doing a series of government-funded volunteering positions. So I was able to work in the Kingdom of Tonga, I worked in Laos, I worked in Afghanistan, and these were programs funded by the Australian government, which meant I was able to work with a local organisation, often with a really great counterpart. And this was in my early 20s. So part of me does feel a little bit bad now that I didn't really have many skills that I was bringing, but I had a really interesting time and I got to learn a lot. So throughout those volunteering experiences, I got to understand a little bit more about what international aid and development was about. And then I undertook my master's in development studies. And then really off the back of some of those volunteering pieces, started working with Oxfam Great Britain in Liberia, and then was with the United Nations in Afghanistan for a few years after that. And then I came back to Australia and worked with Oxfam Australia for about 5 years. And throughout those 5 years, I met a bunch of fabulous women, and together we set up Humanitarian Advisory Group. And that was about 12 years ago now.
Amazing. Why did you feel like it was time to start Humanitarian Advisory Group?
Yeah, well, that's a story in itself, actually. So I had been talking to these 3 other fabulous women about setting up. We were really inspired by the work of Humanitarian Policy Group and the work of Humanitarian Outcomes, like 2 very different organisations, but whose work we had really valued when we'd worked in a range of different contexts. But I was working with Oxfam Australia and had, maybe against my better judgment, had agreed to go on a short deployment to the Solomon Islands after a tsunami response. So was deployed out to an outer island called Tumotu, very beautiful. And the situation was quite dire there. The tsunami had really come across. We were running out of food, this kind of thing. And I was stuck there for quite a while, and I had quite a small baby back at home. And he didn't recognize me when I got back. And I think that was when I thought, other people are better suited to be, if at all we need people deploying to these contexts, it's probably not my game anymore. So what we wanted to do, the four of us, was set up Humanitarian Advisory Group and then be an enabler, an organisation that could ask the hard questions that operational agencies can't because they might lose their permission to work in a certain context. We wanted to be super small so that we could be very, very agile and respond, as quickly as needed. And to be able to provide the evidence for decision makers, in a range of humanitarian thematic areas.
What is it about humanitarian work that is interesting to you? And for people who, maybe are they might be UK charity professionals who are in sort of domestic focused charities. Like, can you talk about what humanitarian coordination is for people that might not know?
Yeah, and thanks for asking for the coordination piece, because that's really, I feel like really in my DNA. When you think of the international humanitarian sector, and this is a hugely broad thing. I mean, in a way you'd think, oh, wow, you've chosen humanitarian. That's really narrow. And then when you get into that, that's huge. It's water engineers and it's protection officers and it's people who work in nutrition or who work on pandemics. It's like a whole range of, surgeons, all these actually really useful people. But then coordination, the most important part of a humanitarian response, which really is ensuring that you can connect people with the resources that they need, that you can provide information to the people who need that. And also that you're able to make a linkage between impacted communities and the people who are trying to respond with protection and services for those populations. And I guess I've seen so many times, I mean, all of us in our work, I think, have met people, then you think, oh, I should connect you with so-and-so, shouldn't I? That would be a good connection. And I think when you're in the midst of an emergency and you think, wow, you haven't met so-and-so yet from another agency, they're doing pretty much exactly the same work as you. And so I became really passionate about wanting to connect people, and in particular, local leaders who had so much of the knowledge and understanding what was going on, but maybe didn't have the line up to decision makers in international organizations, which it shouldn't be this way, but it often is this way. That's where some of the resources are coming in. So it was really trying to ensure that, all those dots were joined up and that you weren't seeing duplication or, priorities going awry.
Yeah, brilliant. One of the when I was doing a little bit of reading and things, one of the quotes that stood with me, and it sort of goes back to the founding of the Humanitarian Advisory Group, but it says on the website, after surviving the bureaucracy of large NGOs and the UN, you then went on to found HAG. Can you talk to me about the bureaucracy? What are the good bits? What are the frustrations?
That's a great question, because I think it seems to be at odds a little bit that you are in a role that's meant to be, like lightning. There's been an emergency. You need to ensure that people have what they need, information, the response. You need to understand the assessment. You need to raise the alarm and tell donors what's really going on, have an advocacy plan, make it all happen instantly. And instead, it's like sending late night emails. Could you approve this by tomorrow? Oh, that's going to go to the next level to the approve. Have you filled out the form? No, I don't think you filled out the form. Now, have you looped in so-and-so? Now, there'll be a telecon at 11 o'clock tomorrow night, and they're going to talk about that. And then there'll be another. So this kind of wading through, the feeling of wading through bureaucracy. And again, I was quite young, again, when I was experiencing some of this, and I think that I was very impatient, and I think I'm naturally an impatient person. Those who have better attention to detail than me may have been like, there's certain things you need to nail down and understand, and processes are there for a reason. But I suppose I started to get to know myself well enough to know that maybe I wasn't that good at navigating all those processes and bureaucracy. And of course, in Australia, when I was working in Oxfam Australia, we would need decisions made but have to go up to the mothership, and you have to wait overnight to find out if that was going to be approved. And the UN system, as you would experience, you would know there was lots of bureaucracy, lots of forms, lots of very formal kind of processes. So I suppose sometimes there was frustration about that, thinking, we are meant to be able to respond and be really nimble, and it didn't feel like that. That being said, I will say in terms of the UN system, there were times when, catastrophic things would go horribly wrong. For example, there was a time where a team of people from the International Rescue Committee were killed in Afghanistan. And I remember being tasked with retrieving them and their personal effects and bringing them back to Kabul. And the heads of IRC were going to come into country. And I remember a day asking people, okay, how do I get this organised? And they said, oh, there's no forms. You just tell us what you need, and we'll get the helicopters and we'll get it all sorted. I remember thinking, okay, so there's a lot of bureaucracy, and then sometimes actually you can just cut through it and you can make things happen. So it's one of those things. And I think it's a double-edged sword. We also do need safeguards, and we do need certain processes that are going to keep people safe. But it's getting the balance right and ensuring you've got agility plus those safety measures.
Yeah. Well, I completely resonate with the sort of process difficulties of I just don't want to feel slow. I want to feel quick. What's the strength, do you think, in a sort of humanitarian leader in impatience? What are the benefits of having impatience?
Yeah. Do you know what? I think you've got to ensure that you have other people in your team. This is, oh my gosh, my Hague colleagues will laugh at this. You need to be surrounded with people who do have attention to detail. Like, it is important. The number of things I feel sometimes I miss because I'm trying to be ahead of things. So I think it's recognizing that is a perspective that is complementary to other perspectives that may take a step back, read to the end of the email before responding. I think it is about having different skill sets and perspectives and ensuring that you can still try and push things along and still be able to maybe bring ideas into the mix. But I firmly recognise that there are a lot of room for all those other skills as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's the benefit of a team, isn't it? It's like you can cover the bases. So, yeah.
Yes.
So I've got two questions in one. For people, again, sort of outside of the humanitarian world and people, and also people who are, but what do NGOs and militaries have in common? And why is civil-military coordination important?
Yes, and I think this is absolutely just as valid for domestic NGOs in the UK or in Australia or any other country, actually. I mean, we saw this during COVID and other kind of crises where you have police and military coming into these kind of situations. So there's a couple of things here. I feel my interest in civil-military coordination actually stems from my love of anthropology, because the military, militaries generally are these really interesting hierarchical control and command organizations where, people have often a very shared experience, they have a shared language, and that can be very different to a lot of NGOs and community-based organizations that we've worked in, which can be very flat. They can be very consultative. They can take a lot of time making decisions. Everyone's involved. I remember hearing from a military colleague in a sectoral coordination meeting, we call them clusters, saying, all right, who's in charge there? And we're like, well, we're all kind of in charge. And this guy sort of said, okay, and who's accountable? Well, it depends. And who's going to make the decision? Well, we're going to do that by consensus. And he was sort of tearing his hair out by the end of the meeting. But that being said, even though those kind of organizational worlds are very different, I would actually say that a lot of people within those organizations can be quite similar, in the term that I think some of us could be described as sort of type A kind of personalities. I think people that are maybe drawn to adrenaline or travel or adventure or really just, wanting to do something that makes a difference. So I think there are some really interesting similarities there. What happens is when you're working with different organizations that have very clear and distinct mandates, that can get a little bit uncomfortable because often militaries might say, well, we're all here for the same reason. I say, oh, no, actually. If we're here to fulfill humanitarian principles, which is around about, humanity, impartiality, neutrality, independence in the way in which we work, by very definition, that is different to a military, political, economic mandate. And that's not right or wrong. It just is. And if we understand those mandates, then we can work together much better. But it is, it's very interesting seeing, what that civil-military interface can look like, especially when it's under pressure.
Do you have examples that come to mind of, I guess that was an example of it not going well, but have you seen examples of it going well? And this, what's the sort of exemplary case study of this relationship?
And I think, and to be honest, I don't think this is specific to civil military coordination or even to the humanitarian sector. And you'll hear a lot of people say this, and I think it's the same, probably maybe in all walks of life, that it all comes down to personality. So I suppose in my role, to give you an example, in Afghanistan as a civil military coordination officer with the UN mission, I got to have a lot of interaction with my particular counterparts at NATO, so the International Security Assistance Force that had many different countries in that mission. And I would, every few months, it seemed I would have, a new kind of counterpart. But people used to stick around for, maybe 6 months or sometimes maybe a year. And then there were 3 in particular of those counterparts that I got to know really well and who, again, were just brilliant at understanding what humanitarian agencies were, how they worked, and that their role was to create an enabling agency for them to function. And what's so lovely about that, David, Scott and Whit were their names, 1 Canadian and 2 Americans, that is now getting on to maybe 18 years ago, and yet we're still all connected. I went over to the US a few years ago and got to see all of them and catch up. And they just were these people that just knew how to facilitate, enable, get stuff done, and also didn't matter if their name was on it. Those kind of people that understood that a job needed to be done, and it was a humanitarian agency's job to undertake particular tasks, and the military piece was just to facilitate. It's not, they maybe had to fix a bridge so a humanitarian convoy could go across and actually implement that. So I have seen it work really well when there is that level of understanding and openness. And so I guess I had a very positive experience in that way. So yeah, and I'm constantly trying to tell that so others can think, okay, all right, military are not just scary. We can actually have a conversation and really try and put across, how we can work in a way that it is not going to endanger populations or others, where that's appropriate. It's not always appropriate, but where it is, we can have that dialogue.
Yeah, amazing. People are people, aren't they? It's regardless of the system, it's sort of the personality piece and working well together as just peers, sort of person to person is the way. All right, Beth. So we've got a recurring section on the show, which is about objects, and you've got 3 objects that sort of represent pivotal moments or moments in your path. So do you want to talk us through the first of those objects?
Yeah. So the first one's a book. It's not like really, I feel like now I should have a shark's tooth or some kind of really exciting thing. But and I think a lot of the people listening will maybe have heard of this book. So this is a book by Peter Singer, and it's called The Most Good That You Can Do. And why I've chosen this is because I think often, and I'm sure this happens to you, Dave, when you sort of say you might work in the charity sector or you work in the humanitarian sector, and people sort of think, oh, wow, you do really good work. You're a really good person. And you think, oh. I love that this book really questioned. At the beginning of this book, there is an example of a guy who Peter Singer is teaching, who's very, very brilliant, and he is making a decision around about do I go into the charity sector, and I can try and understand, if I do my whole career in the charity sector, how many lives can I save? How many people's lives can I have impact upon? Or do I go into, investment banking, and do I give away a large proportion of my salary to a highly specific cause that will have a huge impact? And he actually came up with this very complicated formula to work it all out. And he actually did choose to go on the banking side of things and give, a huge proportion of his salary. And he'd worked out, over his lifetime, he would be able to save, 100,000 lives. It's something really, really gargantuan. And I was just fascinated by this, because I think this book talks about contributing in 3 different ways. So giving of your time. So be that, if you're volunteering, maybe it's the work in which you're doing every day. Giving of your body. So in terms of donating blood, a lot of people in the book just donate a kidney as something to do. And then, and giving of your wealth, or giving of, really giving of your power, really, to those that haven't had access to that. And I find that really, really interesting and very compelling, this idea around, people might say, well, you're doing humanitarian work, that's fabulous, but I don't know, is just sending lots of emails every day really doing very much? I'd like to think a lot of the research that we've done has been helpful, but this just really stood out to me. It really made me question, and made me also realize there's very small things that you can be doing, and that you can constantly chip away at doing better in that piece. So he's a really amazing philosopher, and I think he really, really makes me think about things. So yeah, that's my first item.
So when in your sort of career journey up to this point, when did you read this book for the first time? Roughly.
It's a good question. It was probably only about 5 years ago, actually.
Okay. So my question, if it's quite new or relatively recent in your journey, had you read this book, when you were 20, do you think that it would have influenced a different direction? I'm curious about your view on that. There's those 3 concentric circles.
Yeah.
Would you do anything differently?
See, I'm really bad at maths, so I never would have done the banking piece. That was never going to fly. And I mean, to be quite honest with you, Dave, I'm not going to pretend that I'm a selfless. Like in humanitarian work, I was interested in that because I was interested in anthropology and other cultures. I wanted to travel. I wanted to learn about other cultures and other people. And also, this will sound quite strange, I had and I still do, quite a morbid fascination about inhumanity, in a way, of like trying to understand how people can act in a way that can, wreak havoc on other people, and trying to work out how you can negotiate with that, how you can understand it. Like I think now of situations that we're looking at in the world and thinking, we've done some work at Humanitarian Advisory Group with some behavioural scientists. And I guess I try and think of, I'm sure that, there's been armies of humanitarian scientists being brought in to work out how can we get this person in this negotiation to come around to this way of thinking. Because as they say, there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems. There's only political ones. So humanitarian work is the mandate. We don't pretend that it's the answer at all. That's just meant to keep people alive until the politicians get their shit together. So I guess I'm really interested in how that works, and how we can get people to see inhumanity and to be able to change their behaviour, so that people can be safe and have the access to the services they have a right to. So I don't know if I would have done things differently. I think I would have done things earlier. So, for example, it's only been in the last sort of 6 or 7 years that I've done domestic volunteering. So I volunteer with my local Red Cross in terms of emergency services. And I wish that I'd done that from when I was a student, because all of the same issues are there. It doesn't matter if you're in Kabul or you're in a small country town, that the different mandates, the coordination challenges, agencies being territorial, all the different, politics within that is fascinating, and it's important to be able to navigate that. And I think, I wish I'd done that earlier for sure in terms of giving of my time.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any sort of learnings on why do you think there's sort of inhumanity? I know it's almost like such a big question, but what have you learned about the actors that are being inhumane, and where that might come from, and what are your thoughts on inhumanity?
Yeah, I've tried to work out if there is, and I think this is something I thought about quite a lot, Dave, when I first had children. And I remember thinking, people that have made decisions that have made, these incredible, atrocities and these kind of things. These are also humans who have children. And how is it that they not had a sense of empathy or understanding of what that could feel like for others? And then trying to understand, is it just the overwhelming desire of power and that just blinds you to everything else? Or is there just a blind belief that you are actually making something better for your people or the people that you are leading? That means that at any cost that is worth it. I guess I struggle to understand that, but I guess that's where I get to. Whether or not that's true or not, I don't know. But I've just always been fascinated with it. How can people actually give orders or know that they're pulling levers that are going to allow atrocities to occur? And we are seeing it today, and we've seen it throughout human history. And we have early warning systems, and we have de-radicalization programs and a whole raft of other tools to ensure it doesn't happen again. But it comes down to politics and who has power and who makes decisions. But yeah, we still haven't managed to fix that one, have we?
Not yet. Object 2, Beth. Have you got? What's the second of the objects?
Yeah, I'm quite proud of this one. So I made this one myself. So this is my terrarium. I don't know if can you see the little ladies here?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So this is a terrarium, and the reason I wanted to show this one to you is because it represents an ecosystem. And when you think about the humanitarian system, I very much think about it as an ecosystem. And the reason why, I once went to a really great talk by someone from the International Committee of the Red Cross, and many people are aware of a unique mandate that the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement has, and their emblem and the way in which they operate, and the fact that they're able to do a lot of work behind the scenes, and confidentiality is very important. And, I understood that, but I was listening to this representative of the ICRC, and I remember him saying when someone had sort of criticized, but you know a lot of things and sometimes you don't call it out, and this has been a long-standing, perhaps, criticism of this agency. And I remember the representative saying, you have all these different organizations, and we can only do the work that we do in the way that we are able to have confidential dialogue with all parties to a conflict, for example, because we have the Amnesties International, the Peace Brigades, that we have Human Rights Watch. We are able to do that because we have an ecosystem, a continuum, if you like, of agencies who do things differently. And we don't perfectly fit together, but those different mandates mean we're working at different levels, at different modalities, with different actors at different times. And I remember that just made a lot of sense to me. It wouldn't make sense at all if we were all in an emergency doing the same thing at the same time, the same people. And it made me have a real respect, not only for the different agencies and the systems that we sometimes work within, it also made me be a little more relaxed in my very enthusiastic approach to coordination, that if agencies or organizations or individuals operated outside of that coordination, that's also okay. That perhaps builds redundancy into the system. If that coordination system is not working well, then, it's probably fine that people operate outside of that. So whereas when I was younger, I think I needed everyone in the tent, and I would always be trying to pull in agencies or organizations. No, we all must be here. We all must, be on the same page. And whilst, we don't need it to be like that, actually. Yes, it's great. I do believe it's important to share information, but we can all do that in different ways. And I think understanding that you have, movements like the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, and then you have the Médecins Sans Frontières who do things differently, and then you have international NGOs or local NGOs or private sector or foundations, all these other organizations. It's good that they work differently. It's good that some come in the day before or 2 weeks later. It's good that some are focused on agriculture and livelihoods and some are focused on child protection. We should see it as an ecosystem, and we should respect it as an ecosystem. And we've done some research recently that looked at how international organizations need to take care of that ecosystem when they come in. And we're not for one moment saying they shouldn't be recruiting local staff. They absolutely do, and they absolutely should. And local staff should work wherever they want. But it's also realizing if you take a whole bunch of senior staff from small local organizations who may have been CEO level, senior executives, they come into a larger international organization, maybe they're not in decision-making roles anymore, but then that international organization leaves and donors are looking around saying, so where are these local organizations you say you want to lead the response? And perhaps they're not as strong or have the numbers of people that they may need to be able to take on running multi-year recovery programs or whatever it might be. So it was a piece around respectful recruitment and this concept of, taking care or just really paying heed that there is an ecosystem and we need to ensure that it's healthy today, but also into the future.
Amazing. But I guess I'm curious about the moment of realization for you about the ecosystem piece, because I could, as a coordinator, I could imagine that you get to that realization through almost frustration of it not being coordinated, but then being like, but there's people over there who aren't in our sort of coordination spider web, but that's great and there's redundancy. So I could totally see the value of there being redundancy, but I'm really curious on whether that was obvious from the start or whether that was a learning through almost like on the job frustration.
Yeah. And I think it was just, I guess, a recognition of just knowing also this whole cluster approach that I mentioned, which came in, so it was almost 20 years ago now. The fact is, there was humanitarian response and emergency response before that. And maybe it was a more organic process and it looked different in different places. So although now there is a sense of predictability around kind of leadership and accountability in some of these processes, it's very imperfect. Of course it's imperfect because it's humans running it, and there's still power involved and, all these kind of things. But yeah, I agree that probably the frustration for me was the fact that it's not a case of build it and they will come when it comes to coordination. It has to be worth going to. So when I spoke to some of my friends and colleagues from local organizations and sort of said, and anyone want to come along to these kind of groovy cluster meetings? And they're like, well, they're not really in a language I can speak. So, if you're not, ensuring that the coordination, the mechanisms, is adding value for you. And if you have 4 people in your organization, can you really spare someone to pretty much full time just be sitting in coordination meetings? So it's recognizing that I believe there is a duty to somehow coordinate what you're doing so you are deconflicting or not duplicating, all those kind of things. But you also have to recognize that, for some organizations, it's just not going to be feasible as well. And then being able to sit back and go, okay, well, how can these mechanisms add value for all those who aren't actually at the table? And also looking at what the table looks like. Are there enough seats around the table? Should there be a table? What does that look like? So I just do think the coordination piece is really fascinating because that does influence what the face of a response looked like, whether or not that's in the UK or in Australia or anywhere else. You know, the media will know what's happening with coordination. Often that's the biggest criticism, isn't it? Oh, there was no plan. It was not well coordinated. People didn't share information at the right time. That's often what leaders are most criticized about. So I think, yeah, the more we can hone in on what is good coordination, what is value-added coordination, because we don't coordinate just to coordinate. That's what's meant to provide services and protection for people who've been impacted. That's what we have to remember. It's a function.
Yeah. Object 3, and then we'll get onto some broad, some ambiguous, some specific questions. But let's do the final object.
Number 3. This is a hag bag. So this hag bag, I'm showing you this because when we first set up Humanitarian Advisory Group, because we are called hags, by the way, we're the proud hags. For years, we joked about, we will know that we've made it when we have hag bags. We should have tote bags. Oh my God, we should have bags. So it wasn't like, it was 8 years into us existing. We got hag bags. But it was such a moment of thinking, wow, we're like really an organization now. I mean, we're still really small. We still only go to the office once a week. But the fact that we had hag bags, it was really a moment. And we've so enjoyed, you know, when we go, when we host events and when we travel overseas, you know, giving people our hag bags is always such a thrill. And we had them made by a wonderful organisation in Australia called Sisterworks, which is a social enterprise that is led by migrant women. And it was set up by a group of women who met when they were learning English in Australia. And they took all these amazing pictures of all these women screen printing our hag bags. And it was during COVID. And they sent them to us and said, look, we've been making your hag bags. And they just ended up being really, really special. And I think it was just sort of a moment of like, we've got bags now. Like, we've really made it, you know. Everything we've achieved up to this point, you know, we don't even need to discuss because we've got the hag bag. So, it was a real symbol of us, you know, getting to the point where we thought, all right, this is going to be important. And also it was during COVID where we were wanting to ensure that other social enterprises like us were going to be able to survive. And we were very busy during COVID, looking at a lot of COVID evaluations and other bits and pieces. And it felt so great to be able to put in this order of hag bags with this great social enterprise in Melbourne and get our wonderful bags back. So, yeah, it was a great time.
Amazing. What was if you look back on the sort of founding of the organisation, what were the biggest challenges that you had to overcome? It could be, you know, income or people, or what are the challenges that you've had to go through to get to 2024?
Oh, it's always money, of course. But I mean, to be honest, it's been a really organic process in the way that, to be honest, when Humanitarian Advisory Group was first set up, like I don't even know if I thought it would even be a job. Maybe it was just like a side hustle or a fun thing that we did on weekends. But it kind of got a life of its own, really. And it seemed that there really was appetite for an organisation that sat kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out of the formal system, that wasn't implementing, but was able to reflect back on the system, what was hard, to be able to help to ask some of those questions, to be able to not just find out was hard, but then be able to create some tools and some really practical insight and then apply that behavioural science lens to be able to say, okay, well, we've just, you know, provided you with an evaluation. Every single one of the findings you already knew. So what then? What can we do to actually shift the dial and make it easier for agencies to work with donors or, you know, boost accountability to communities who have been impacted? So we got to ask all those really interesting questions. So I think the hard things were, I mean, to be honest, all of us, when we started the organisation, as I mentioned earlier, we all had really small children. So to be very frank, at the beginning, it was the fact that going backwards financially, because childcare cost more than what we were paid from that first little while. So it was sort of, again, trying to work out how long you could do that for until we started to break even and then kind of move forward. And then it was trying to juggle, traveling different places whilst you had caring responsibilities. And And I think one of the best things that we did that really helped us was recognizing very early on that it doesn't make sense, regardless of our personal circumstances, to be flying all over the world doing stuff, because people in those countries already know far better than us. So it was all around creating partnerships and relationships with local experts and consultants and research organizations and think tanks and universities that were already doing brilliant work. We have a focus on the Indo-Pacific region. It just meant that some of the time their work wasn't being talking about in Geneva in our formal system. So again, it comes back to joining the dots. And, then yes, some of our research partners, they are the ones now speaking in Geneva, or, this week in Bangkok at Regional Humanitarian Partnerships Week. So it was really around just trying to elevate the work that was already being done. And then we were able to have different funding sources and networks, and to be able to create some of these unusual partnerships and then tackle some of these really big humanitarian issues and create practical pathways to trying to do things differently.
Yeah. It's a bit of a curveball question, but on the big humanitarian challenges and the crises, the sort of live crises now, whatever they are, I wondered if you could give us sort of hope and optimism about the world. Like, what's your take on hope and optimism in a context where it's really easy to not be hopeful?
Yeah. And I wonder if this is a luxury that I have from looking at this from Australia, that I guess I can say, but we don't have a choice but to hope. But I think that maybe that's not something I would expect for someone in Gaza at the moment, or in Ukraine, or in Sudan, or in Haiti. So maybe that's a little bit of a, but I guess I sort of feel like there's those who are in the midst of things and don't have the space within them to hope because they're, fighting for their survival. So it's almost like we almost have to hope on their behalf and push forward and use our energy and our time to demand something better. And whilst we have failed, and we absolutely have failed, we are failing today in terms of the context that we see. That doesn't give us a leave pass to give up either. We have to redouble efforts. And every day I'm hearing of work that people are doing, which is, it's just extraordinary what people do, the ingenuity in which they're trying to deliver, the negotiations that they're trying to undertake. And yes, I know we do hear about the failures a lot. There are some good things happening. I mean, we do hear about some incredible ways in which people are able to deliver both protection and assistance. But I feel like we shouldn't have we shouldn't have the luxury to give up. Those who are in the midst of it, absolutely. But those of us who are working in the system and are on the outside, we're the ones that have to keep that energy going and ensure we keep that hype alive.
Yeah, bro. What have you who have you spoken to in a humanitarian response setting? Somebody who, you're aiming in whatever that role was to support, to sort of directly. Of those people, who has challenged your thinking the most? Do you remember a conversation that you had where sort of one conversation with one person led to a different way of thinking?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes even just being somewhere, the fact that you are in a different context. So I'm thinking of when I worked with a local organisation in Afghanistan, it was the only female in that organisation. And we were talking about, cultural approaches to providing assistance, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. And we did have a lot of interesting discussions around where do culture and human rights collide. The feeling about universal human rights and other people saying, no, that's just being imposed on us. But I think, I don't know, I do believe there is a universalness somewhere. And there definitely were conversations of trying to understand, and this is on, some reflections I've been having recently as well about, so yes, you may not agree with, girls' education in Afghanistan, all right, but how do you then talk about who is going to deliver the baby of your wife? And how do you talk about the impacts of a decision today, what that is going to look like further down the line? So I think it is around trying to talk to people in a way that will allow for us all to use our imagination about what things can be like. And whilst that's not, sometimes may not always be possible, I think it's really important for us to, I go back to that term empathy, of really trying to sit in someone else's shoes and really try and see where people are coming from. And again, you can't do that to the, if you have, cultural and religious and ethnic and gender and a whole range of other layers, obviously, to people's identity. But it is trying to communicate in a way that you can, form an argument or try and persuade people to be able to shift or see different points of view. And I think that's what a lot of it is. I think it's really trying to also us to listen as well. Like what kind of support do people want to get? So I'll give you an example. We had a really interesting protection of civilians gathering in Afghanistan, and it was at a time where we had so Afghan military, we had international military, and we had community members, proxy of Taliban and others in the room. And there was this conversation around, so we understand that this is from the international military, that your main concern must be around airstrikes and the civilian casualties from airstrikes. And then watching the faces of these senior international military officers when they heard from communities, yes, of course, we're concerned about airstrikes. We are equally concerned about night raids where groups of men with dogs break down the door and come into a compound and see our women, and the social ramifications that has in communities is every bit as important to us as the airstrikes. And that was not what had been expected to come out of those meetings from particular people there. And seeing that communication happening and sort of seeing people trying to understand what was being communicated and what that would mean for future operations it was incredible to see that. But, we make assumptions all the time about how people must think or feel. But if we really stop and listen, we need to stop and listen, but we also have to realize that we may have to act very differently to what we first may have thought. And that's a real skill. I think a skill that I'm always having to get better at myself.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about it in lots of different sort of indirect ways. But I was wondering if you could, firstly, for people who might not know, what is localization, and also why does it feed into everything? Why is this an important part of the conversation? Arguably the most important part of the conversation.
Yeah. And again, I would say that, for those listeners who are based in the UK and again, maybe working in the domestic sector with community organisations there or anywhere else, although it sounds like a fancy word, doesn't it? Localization. And a lot of people really hate it. And they also hate it because it sounds like you do it to someone. Dave, I'm going to localize you. Mm-hmm. It sounds quite foreboding. But if you've sort of talked about community leadership or communities being able to articulate their priorities and work receive assistance in a way that is appropriate and timely and they would prefer. Like, it sounds really logical and really basic. But I guess the piece behind it, of course, is, yes, we can sort of say, of course, it should be, we should be providing assistance and protection the way people would want, to whom should receive that, when they should receive it, the right assistance in the right way. But of course, there's power behind that, isn't there? Because who's giving the assistance? It's often, if you look at where the money comes from in the international humanitarian system, it's coming from powerful, rich governments. And they don't want to relinquish that power. So even though we are sort of saying, well, you're going to be able to save more lives in a way that is, more appropriate, more timely, that provides dignity for communities, the pushback is, it's very risky, to trust giving money directly to local organisations or local communities. Although we've seen numerous times that international organisations, they too can do the wrong thing. But for some reason, we save all our distrust to community organisations. But yes, there's been, and I think in longer term development, the conversation has been going for much longer. It's always been this acknowledgement that there needs to be ownership and buy-in for a program to work. You want the people to design any kind of intervention. You want people to be able to very clearly put forward their priorities and very clearly be able to tell you what success looks like for them. So again, it sounds really straightforward, but it seems we're not getting very far. I mean, the latest reports, there was a little bit of a spike during COVID where you couldn't have lots of white people riding off on their trusty steeds to save people in developing countries. So we did see local organisations get a little bit more of a piece of the pie, if you like, in terms of funding, but that's gone back down. It's 1.8% of all funding. Like, it's absolutely minuscule. So even though it's what we talk about from a policy point of view, there's still a lot of barriers in terms of making that a reality. And I also linked to that is something I think about if I think about Australia or the UK or other kind of countries where a lot of this aid comes from. It's also, I believe, we overlook the importance and the perspectives of diaspora communities. So we would, any kind of emergency happening in the world right now, there are diaspora communities in both of our countries whom would have networks, relationships, insights, perspectives, ideas, any myriad of ways in which they could provide advice to governments. And I don't see that as being seen as an incredible wealth of information the governments could draw upon.
Why do you think that's being missed? Do you think it's just a lack of awareness, or?
No. It's what I hear all the time, and it's what I hear about why you can't trust communities as well. They have an agenda. So of course, your government or my government, Dave, doesn't have an agenda, does it? Not at all. But no, diaspora groups, they have an agenda. No, they have an agenda. And so do local organisations. Couldn't trust them. They'll have their own, barrow to push. And I just feel like I'm not saying you have to believe or take on board every single thing that diaspora group might tell you, but if you're about to program something on the other side of the world, wouldn't it make sense that you sat down with people and sort of said, okay, what are you hearing? What are you, I'm not saying that you take that as the perfect truth and you only use that source of information to design your program, but surely that should be feeding in, and there would be someone who might say, well, I know someone that could give you some information. And, I just feel like the level of distrust when it comes to some communities, I don't think is warranted. And I feel like we really could listen a lot better.
Yeah. I mean, you've sort of touched on it. One of the things I wanted to ask started with what you've mentioned about the sort of state of play right now, I guess, on the shift to local organisations leading the way. So could you, just touch on sort of where we're at? Because you've been part of sort of frameworks, developing frameworks to measure progress. So can you talk to us about the sort of it doesn't sound great in terms of post-COVID coming down, but also what are the sort of traditional power dynamics between states, between NGOs, and between local organisations that are at play and need to be shifting? What does that actually look like?
So sometimes it can be very multi-layered. So you've got, the big institutional donor at the top that is often, because of the money that they are giving, that's taxpayers' money. So they have a lot of compliance requirements to be able to receive that money. So they're able to report on it, and it's being able to be scrutinized. And I'm not criticizing that, but understanding that. So it might be then that goes to big international, and it might be an organization of that country. So, for example, it might be Oxfam Great Britain, for example. So all the kind of compliance that needs to be there, and it's heavy. Again, I'm not saying it's all wrong, but I think people often think, oh, these organizations are so well-meaning, they just go off good intentions. No, they're highly professionalized. There would be some of your listeners that might think, oh, I'd love to work for Oxfam. My gosh, to get a job at Oxfam, you need like 5 PhDs, 20 years experience, 17 languages. Like, it's highly professionalized and highly competitive. Much more so than when I joined, when I was much younger. And I sort of see the kind of the caliber of people, but the kind of professionalism that is needed to manage these kind of grants, the technical skills that people need to have, the financial skills, safeguarding, the compliance, the legal, the contracts. Like, there is a lot going on there. Then that might go down to a country office, then it may go down then to a local organization, and maybe down to a community organization. So you need to have that downstream, they call it downstream compliance. And then, of course, what we've been advocating is also, how about that upstream accountability, both ways? How, are you hearing from communities, actually, that's not what I wanted, or it was late, or are you actually taking my feedback into account? And if so, how are you changing your program? So there are these kind of different levels. And I think when it comes to looking, though, at the locally led agenda and some of the frameworks that you mentioned, which we've been very fortunate enough to have co-designed with local organisations. So in particular, working with the Pacific Islands Association of NGOs, which has members all throughout the Pacific. And what was really interesting about that first framework, and I've touched a bit on the financial bit, but was the fact that it's not just about money. I mean, yes, money is important because money is power, but actually that framework has 7 dimensions. It's about decision-making. It's about advocacy. It's about policy influence, a whole range of other things. It's not just about, oh, we'll give you the money, because you can still give people the money, but they don't have agency to be able to make decisions on what to spend it on, if that you're just giving it in that way. So it's really trying to look at how it really is more just about shifting power. And I think that's the sticky bit. The US, their International Development Agency, USAID, have a big policy now on locally led humanitarian response. And there is, a lot of talk about this at the highest level, but it's still very slow to move because it is about power. It is about giving power. It's about shifting power and recognizing that if you don't do that, that it's kind of not really locally led.
What does good humanitarian leadership look like?
Yeah. I mean, good humanitarian leadership, it needs, in my opinion, needs to start with humility and a lot of self-awareness and awareness about what you don't know. I think maybe as we get older, we realize how much we don't know, which means you can, as you go through your career, sort of looking back on things you've done in the past, thinking, it's a lot about relationships and connections. I often give the example of when I was working in Afghanistan, there was a woman called Margareta Wallström. She was the acting head of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs at the time, who I was working with. And I'd never met her, but she was super senior. And the UN's pretty hierarchical as well. But she was coming for a visit, and I was very junior and didn't really know what I was doing. I was told to organise the visit, and I was like, sure, I'll get some sandwiches. So she's flying in from New York, and and what was really interesting, that she had worked in Afghanistan several years prior. She had been the chief of staff for the UN mission. And I knew that she was super senior. So I wasn't expecting that when she arrived, she got out of the car in our UN compound, and she was walking down the corridor, that she remembered the name of every, like, she was in the parking lot, she remembered the names of every driver in the parking lot. We got in, she remembered the name, of Aziz, who made the tea. She just remembered the names of, like, like all the people in the building, and they had been saying to me, oh, when she was here, we loved her so much. She really knew what was going on. She really cared about people. And it really mattered that, and I just thought, wow, she's come back like 5 years later. She still had those connections. And I think that I probably hadn't had contact with someone who actually was so senior at that time. This is one of my first job with the UN. And I was so impressed that she'd still taken the time, and it was also just who she was, that, and I just never forget it. And the way that she was just very good at asking questions. I think a leader asks questions. You're able to steer the conversation in the way in which you ask those questions. You don't have to know everything, but if you ask the right questions, you're able to shift the conversation forward. And she absolutely did that. I think also walking the talk when it comes to taking care of yourself and your team and your family and others. I think it's one thing to say, oh, everyone should take time, do some well-being, sniff some essential oils, blah, 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 blah. I haven't taken leave for 9 years. And I would see that all the time of people sort of, I haven't had an hour off for 17 years, but you should go and eat your lunch. And I just think if that's just so hollow, if you don't every now and then be honest about how you're traveling or what you need, then you can't expect anyone else in your team to do that either. So, I often get asked about humanitarian leadership because some of these leaders, they're in the midst of it. Can you imagine being the humanitarian coordinator in Gaza at the moment, humanitarian coordinator in Sudan? Like, these are people that have to take in incomplete information, make life and death decisions, talk to a range of different people, have incredible negotiation skills, then be able to turn it on and talk to donors and really convince them to be able to support the programs. Then they need to be able to talk to media and be able to communicate complexity to the general public. Then they need to be able to look at their own staff and be able to ensure that they're going to be able to sustain working for another couple of years where they are. So it's all of these things all at once. So, I do. Some of those people are just absolutely amazing, and I don't know how they do it. But I do feel like we need to ensure that we keep investing in humanitarian leaders and ensuring that we're getting people from all walks of life that are going into those roles, that it's seen as everybody's business and everyone's responsibility to provide that leadership on protection and assistance.
Yeah. I'm curious about whether it's you and through your own experiences or things you've witnessed in those leaders, like that example. Are there tactics that you've seen or sort of employ yourself in terms of protecting yourself from, like giving yourself in the midst of this horrific context so often? How are you or they sort of protect, other than essential oils, of course? How are you protecting well-being? Because it's going to be tough. This barrage of super intense, like life or death decisions, sort of thing. Like, how do you protect yourself in that context?
Yeah, I think you make friends. I mean, my dear Afghan friends, for example, who are still really close to now. You make friends. I mean, also in my case, I fell in love. That helped as well. And it's recognizing still that you may be in a context, but you are who you are, and there's certain things and different things that people need to sustain themselves. I think it's also, though, having an open mind to understanding more of just what you're seeing in the context. So my first boss in Afghanistan, Engineer Jawad, an incredible man, he also taught me stuff around, I guess I'd gone there just thinking, very narrowly about aid and development, what these programs might look like, and is it nutrition or is it shelter? What does that look like? And he taught me about cultural heritage. He said, what's it all for if you keep people alive and they have no cultural identity? They have nowhere to celebrate. They have nowhere to go and have a picnic with their family. They are not able to, or should they need to walk past the rubble of a beautiful or sacred building that was important in their lives, and to have to walk past it every day. And some of the projects that we did at this local NGO, which was around rebuilding some of that cultural heritage, and that was not something I had any inkling about him. He's an architect and an engineer and knew all about this kind of stuff, but it's not something I'd considered. I had a very narrow understanding of that, and learning from him around understanding rebuilding or supporting a society to rebuild itself is not only the provision of life-saving peace, it's also the life-thriving pieces as well. What does it take for people to thrive or to heal or to move forward or to also, it's like one of those wonderful NGOs, Film Aid, which people would say, oh, why would you have an NGO that goes and plays movies to people? Well, my gosh, to give two people a couple of hours off from the trauma they may have experienced, or to be able to laugh for a couple of hours, like that's absolutely essential for people. So I think it is thinking about all the different ways in which we not just care for ourselves, but how we talk to communities and recognize, listen, what do they really want? They also may want a playground for their children. They also may want something different to what we expect they may want. But we have, our lives are made up by rituals and celebrations and, things that we look forward to. And, we need to recognize that those don't stop in the midst of a war. Those don't, people are still falling in love and getting married and doing things despite what's happening. And it's how we can support people to keep going with that.
Yeah. So before we get into, we've got some sort of rapid questions to wrap up, but just the last sort of quite broad question. As charities, NGOs, we're around sort of boards of trustees often. If you were putting together a personal board of trustees, who's going on there? I guess I'm getting into sort of influencers and mentors. Like who are the three board members?
Dave, wow.
And why?
Hey, wow. Oh, wow. Okay. Wow. Yeah, I mean, I would want... Yeah, I would want someone like Engineer Jawed, who I've worked with in the past, who can always bring a radically different point of view and who is wonderfully connected in different halls of power and different kind of organizations. I would want, and I know I'm not giving you names here, but I would want someone young. I sometimes get frustrated when people talk about, young people today. And I talk to young people who are, maybe at university or finishing school and think, wow, actually the world is in great hands. I'm really sorry of the world that we're handing them, and I apologize for it. But I think of the way in which they think, the way in which they are approaching things, and I only feel hope. So I would absolutely want someone really young who is hasn't been yet told that it's not possible. And then maybe I would, and obviously the other person I'd want is David Attenborough. So, because then I get to hang out with him all the time. And someone that can bring the centrality of nature and creation and the essentialness of natural beauty and someone that kind of introduced like the whole generation of people into these far-flung lands and why we should think about, when we're saving lives, that we should also be treading gently on the environment, which is something we've been trying to do more work on. And and I'm sure it is something that people say, I'm too busy saving lives, I can't think about the environment. But if we're only going to cause more problems by not thinking about that. So, yeah, I would like to see, very much a board that can have robust discussions. Maybe you'd throw someone like Hugo Slim in there as well, that is a theologist, and I would say a philosopher as well, who always asks some very hard questions. I know I'm having heaps of names now. I'm just going the whole way. I'd also Mary Robinson. She's probably the chair of the board. So yeah, I've got a great board there. So
all right, so we're in the final stages. We've got four rapid questions before we wrap up. So, Beth, another organisation that you admire and why?
I would say the Australian Red Cross, because they managed to work both internationally and domestically while still living their humanitarian principles.
What do you think the most misunderstood aspect of humanitarianism is?
Neutrality. I hear it criticized a lot, and I think I would just say that you can still be on the side of humanity even whilst being neutral.
So a phone network has come to you and said, Beth, we're going to give you the opportunity to send a text to every humanitarian personnel member across the world. So you've got the text limitations, the character limitations in that text. What are you saying to them?
I'm going to say, go local, go green, be brave.
Amazing. I love that. And finally, who is an under-the-radar leader that you think is doing an amazing job?
It's a good question, Dave. Under the radar leader. I mean, maybe she's not exactly under the radar, but I would say I mentioned Piango, the Pacific Islands Association of NGOs. Siale, who is the executive director there. Yeah, she's well known in our small pocket of the world. But to be honest, I got to spend some time with her in Papua New Guinea 2 weeks ago. And I won't deny, when we were having some conversations in my head, I was thinking, is it out of the realm of possibility that you would be the next Secretary General of the UN? Because she has a way of communicating with such gravitas and presence. People couldn't possibly say no to her. Yeah. So I remember just thinking, so she's not under the radar, but I feel like she's not perhaps at the level that we would all love her to be at.
Yeah. I mean, I know this is supposed to be a rapid fire round, but what is it about what gravitas, what is it about her that, how are you spotting that as a potential thing that happens next?
It's because she leads with such a connection to emotion. She expresses herself from her heart so deeply that you cannot not be captivated by what she's saying. You are moved not just intellectually, but really in your soul when she speaks to you. And she brings to the conversation, she brings the history that she speaks of. She brings the kind of, Pacific wisdom and knowledge and approaches. And she just, I don't know, she has this real knack to be able to connect. And I think this, solidarity is something that she speaks to a lot. And I think that if we had someone that was perhaps on the global stage, she could bring that solidarity to many more people.
Amazing. Beth, thank you so much for this conversation. Is there anything anything on your mind that you'd like to say at this point before we wrap?
So many questions I'd like to ask you, Dave. Now that you put me on the spot, I think, I just think it's great you're doing this podcast, and I think it's great. I love that you have framed some of your questions in terms of speaking to people who are working domestically in the UK, because I really feel very passionate that we shouldn't be siloing so much between international humanitarian work or development or community development, whatever we might call it, and what we do in countries that we might live in or particular context. I feel like we lose a lot of cross-learning, cross-pollination, lessons, tools, friendships, networks by seeing those as being very separate. I believe that everyone in an emergency wants to be treated with dignity. I don't see there being a difference. So I feel like the more we should move towards that and recognise that there is that common humanity, the better, I think.
Amazing. Whilst we're live, I'll ask you, so you commit on camera. Can we do a part 2 at some point? Because there's so much more, I think, to chat about.
Of course.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much, Beth. See you in a bit.